We begin the great 3 days of the Paschal celebration known as the Triduum, the Triduum. And Maundy Thursday is a complex day. A lot is a part of that day. We have to wonder, what was it that happened that Thursday evening? We certainly see references to this significant evening in all four Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all tell pretty much the same story. Jesus is at the table with his disciples, and he gives them the bread and the wine with the words, "This is my body, this is my blood." In John's Gospel, there is a mention of the meal, but there's no mention of the bread and wine, nothing to refer to what we would think of as the Eucharist. And it is in John's Gospel, and only John's Gospel, that we have the mention of the foot washing. So in terms of the institution of the Eucharist, that main celebration that many of us think of with Maundy Thursday, of course, the references to the bread and wine, traditional Passover meals would have had blessings of both the bread and the wine, sometimes before, sometimes after the meal. Jesus adds to those blessings these phrases, the phrases of "this is my body" and "this is my blood." The references in the Gospels are not the first of the evidence that we have of this communal meal. There are lots of them earlier in 1 Corinthians, whether or not people eat the meal worthily or not. And then certainly Paul writes to the Corinthians in chapter 11, "I tell you what I learned, that on the night that he was betrayed, Jesus took bread." The first chunk of that's in 1 Corinthians 10, and then the one that I just referred to is in 1 Corinthians 11. So the Eucharist celebration, or the eating of the Lord's Supper, or this sacred meal, goes back to at least Paul, and certainly, so they're remembering this within 15, 20 years after Jesus' death. And it, of course, has become the main, one of the main features of Christian worship. The fact, or it wasn't really associated with Maundy Thursday, or this Thursday, at least in terms of an evening Eucharist, until the 6th and 7th centuries in Europe. The foot washing, the other piece, main piece that we tend to associate with Maundy Thursday, is, like I say, only referred to in John. And the earliest reference we have to this as a liturgical action is from the late 3rd century, the rite of the church in Milan during the time of St. Ambrose. But it wasn't really connected with Maundy Thursday until the 7th century. Now, why? What was this all about? And one of the features that was associated with Maundy Thursday early on was the reconciliation of penitents. And they would be cleansed and readmitted to the church and the church's sacraments on Easter. And so some scholars have associated this cleansing, this sacramental cleansing, as part of what's going on in terms of this foot washing, at least liturgically. Others point to it being an imitation of the humility of Christ, that Jesus washing his disciples' feet was a great act of great humility. Problem, of course, for us moderns is that we don't do foot washing. It doesn't have the same kind of resonances for us, and so we really have to look back and reinsert ourselves in an ancient time to really understand this rite in all of its rich symbolism. Some folks in the time of the coronavirus have suggested that we wash each other's hands, that is an act of servitude, and there may be something there, but The foot washing has been a part of Maundy Thursday for quite some time. Some more uh, recent uh, additions were the question of the reservation of the sacrament and the altar of repose, and then followed by the stripping of the altar. For many years, early on, the Eucharist wasn't celebrated, nor was communion received between Maundy Thursday and Easter. And so taking things off of the altar was pretty utilitarian. But then there was a desire for receiving communion at the Good Friday liturgy. They weren't going to celebrate the Eucharist, but decided that they would distribute communion from the reserved sacrament. And so all of a sudden you've got the reservation of the sacrament going away and then coming back, and being distributed on Good Friday in some places. And this began in the late 7th or early 8th century in Rome. Originally, the sacrament was just taken from the altar, and a reserved sacrament was just taken and put in a sacristy. Later, then, when they were starting to distribute it on Good Friday, they would take it to a side altar in large churches and decorate those, and then there would be a vigil of watching with Jesus at what became known as the altar of repose. The stripping of the altar began around the same time, 7th century, maybe in Spain, some evidence of it in 8th century Rome. The washing of the altar probably was utilitarian in its origins, just part of the pre-Easter cleanup of the church. But as has been the case with many utilitarian liturgical acts, it was enriched by theological reflection, but also increased symbolic imagery and things like that. And so the barrenness of the altar and the chancel area, with everything taken out, became associated with the desolation of the Passion. There are a couple of other things that have been associated with this with the Triduum, and those are the like I mentioned earlier, the reconciliation of the penitents. That one has kind of gone away. There are other ways of dealing with that reconciliation. But early in the day on Maundy Thursday, bishops would bless the oils used for baptism and the anointing of the sick. This is known as the Chrism Mass, and that would be done on Maundy Thursday. And then in post-Vatican II years, so since the mid-60s, it became common in the Roman Catholic Church, and then picked up by the Anglican Church, to have the clergy gather with their bishop and to renew their ordination vows. And that is something that happens here in the Episcopal Church in Colorado. We don't do it on Maundy Thursday. We do it on Tuesday of Holy Week, at least on the Front Range. We gather in the cathedral. And generally, there's another one on Wednesday of Holy Week out in Grand Junction. All of this changed in Colorado to allow for the great distances that the bishop has to travel. So Maundy Thursday, a complex day that begins the Triduum. Here we start with those events that were there that night before Jesus died, as we hear in the liturgy. The last question is, why is it called Maundy Thursday? And in John's Gospel, after the story of the washing of the feet, Jesus begins what's often called his great farewell discourse, and this is found in chapter 13 of the Gospel of John. And in verse 34 of there, Jesus is recorded as saying, "I give you a new commandment, love one another. You must love one another just as I have loved you." and it is that new commandment, mandatum, is the Latin for for commandment, and so it's Maundy comes from that mandatum, that commandment. Um, it's not Maundy Thursday, but Maundy Thursday, the new commandment Thursday.